Today, we are going to learn about the Indian Act, a Canadian law that has had a big impact on the lives of Indigenous peoples for many years. In this video, we will explain what the Indian Act is, why it was created, what rules it sets, how it has affected First Nations communities, and why it is still important to understand today. What is the Indian Act? The Indian Act is a law made by the Canadian government that deals with many aspects of the lives of First Nations peoples. It was first passed over 100 years ago and has been changed several times since then. The Act sets out rules about who is recognized as a First Nations person, how reserve lands are managed, and many other parts of daily life. In simple terms, the Indian Act is a set of rules that the government uses to decide how it interacts with Indigenous communities, and it covers everything from education and healthcare to culture and traditions. Why the Indian Act was created? The Indian Act was created at a time when the government wanted to have control over how the lands and peoples of Canada were managed. Back then, many European settlers were moving into areas where First Nations had lived for generations, and there were many disagreements and conflicts about land and resources. The government decided to create a law that would set out rules and try to manage these problems. They believed that by having clear rules, they could organize the growing country more effectively. Although the intentions were often about control and order, the way the Act was made and used has led to many problems and debates that continue to this day. What the Indian Act does. The Indian Act does many things that affect the lives of First Nations peoples. It outlines who is considered a member of a First Nation, which can affect things like the right to live on reserve lands and access certain services. The Act also gives the government a lot of power over how reserve lands are used and how money is spent in these communities. It sets rules for how First Nations peoples can run their own affairs, such as choosing leaders or managing schools and healthcare. Because the Act covers so many parts of life, it has a strong influence on many daily decisions and long-term plans in First Nations communities. How the Indian Act has affected Indigenous peoples. The impact of the Indian Act on Indigenous peoples has been very significant. For many First Nations communities, the rules set out in the Act have changed the way they live, sometimes in ways that are not always positive. The Act has been used to control who belongs to a community and who can live on reserve lands, which has led to feelings of loss and confusion for many people. It has also limited the ability of First Nations to make their own decisions about their lives and cultures. Over time, many Indigenous leaders and community members have worked hard to change or challenge parts of the Indian Act, arguing that it does not respect their rights or their traditions. This ongoing struggle is part of a larger story about fairness and the need for respectful partnerships between the government and First Nations. Why the Indian Act is important to understand today. Even though the Indian Act is very old, its effects are still felt today. It is important to learn about the Act because it helps us understand the history of Canada and the challenges that First Nations peoples have faced. By knowing about the Indian Act, we can see why many Indigenous communities work hard to protect their culture, language, and traditions. Understanding the Act also helps everyone realize the importance of fair and respectful treatment when it comes to making laws and decisions that affect people's lives. It reminds us that history is full of lessons, and that listening to all voices is the first step towards a better future. Final thoughts. The Indian Act is a complex law that has shaped the way First Nations peoples live in Canada. It was created with the goal of managing a growing country, but its effects have been far-reaching and sometimes hurtful. By learning about what the Indian Act is, why it was created, what rules it sets, and how it has affected Indigenous communities, we can better understand the challenges and changes that are still happening today. Thanks for watching. Simplify your teaching journey with super simple sheets. Across Canada, we're known for our ready-to-use, curriculum-aligned worksheets. Dive into our educational solutions at supersimplesheets.com. Super Simple Sheets. From coast to coast, worksheets that work.